What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I'm the design lead of Summoners Rift Team's live pod, and let's talk about patch 14.17. We're switching over to sheets. We're going dark mode. Let's get it. Let's talk about the patch. What's in this patch? Well, we're gearing up for Worlds. Worlds is in patch 14.18, so this is a largely pro-focused patch. We tended to hit things that we thought clearly made sense for pro and also clearly made sense for solo queue. We are generally reserving changes that we think have the chance to actively hurt solo queue for if we're doing them at all in point 18. To be clear, there's still more investigation to be done for what we're going to do in point 18. We're going to start that work in earnest in a couple of days. And so we'll see. But you know, we did it for MSI, we did it for Worlds last year. Like, we'll do this a little bit where we'll make changes that aren't like great for solo queue, but we think will make a better pro viewing experience, which like for really big tournaments like Worlds and MSI, I think is reasonable at the cost of 2 weeks of solo queue being less balanced than it would otherwise be. I think that's a reasonable thing, a reasonable price to pay at any given time. Again, for those 2 patches out of the year where that's the case here. Again, in this patch, I think every single change I would defend as valid for solo queue, whether for low MMR or high MMR. Maybe only one of those specifically, but I think every one of these changes is defensible for solo queue. And then the things where it's like, wow, I really don't think this champion needs to be nerfed, but we're gonna do it for pro anyway. That kind of stuff might be there in point 18. But anyway, yeah, Worlds is the next patch, the one that's going live in about 3 weeks. Overall in this patch, there's a bunch of anti-ADC systems nerfs. At the end of the day, we're still seeing the invasion of a lot of AD carries and physical ranged champions in mid and top that aren't traditionally there. And it's not just in pro, we're seeing it in higher elos as well. And so we're going to keep going for systems nerfs that try to address this. Ultimately, at the end of the day, these things don't have a huge effect in like how much bot lane matters in the game, right? We're not usually just like directly nerfing typical AD carries. Like the last Lucian changes, for example, were like minus 2% win rate in mid lane, plus 0% win rate bot lane. Like we managed to keep that stuff pretty flat, which is good. But there are some more anti-ADC system nerfs to try to make sure that we can have more than just double AD, double marksman comps kind of every game in pro. It feels like a large portion of games are that. So really trying to unwind that to a certain degree. There are also some tank support systems nerfs. So did some spot checking here. The average enchanter support lost about 1% win rate going from patch 14.9 to 14.10 and hasn't gained it back since. 14.10 was the patch where we moved around Knight's Vow, but it was kind of a buff, and also buffed Warmogs. And we just seem to be in a state where like clearly the systems have moved enchanters down a lot and tanks up, considering I think the power level of enchanter kits is reasonable and the power level of enchanter items is reasonable because we didn't nerf them. This means that the overall system, the level of systems that tank sports are using have just clearly gotten stronger and kind of pushed them out of the meta. And so in an effort to not constantly just on loop power creep the game, anytime essentially a system or a class loses power, and there were indirect changes there, it means something else gained power, and we should go to try to address that, right? So I usually try to keep an eye towards what's been true in the past, where have we gone since then, and try to anchor us a little bit so that we don't permanently power creep the game. In the short term, it's not a huge deal. In the long term, it's very important to anchor ourselves to a certain degree. So regardless, there's some tank sort of support systems nerfs going in here. The goal is to hopefully long term claw back about 1% win rate for people who aren't using the systems that these tank supports are using. We're overall hitting some AP junglers. We think that the AD mid sort of metagame that we're seeing is driven by 2 factors. One, that the AD mids are quite good. There are other systems level changes that I think have impacted this that we're not going to unwind like incredibly soon, but I think there's more than just AP junglers are good and like fleet footwork is good. I think there's other stuff going on here as well, but for now it's looking at the AP junglers. And so one is like we're clearly in a state now where people consider champions like Brand and Zyra actually viable, and that's great. Nidalee's in the metagame as well, which is actually really cool to see. I'm glad like we're seeing Nidalee. This champion has for so long had to have been balanced around exclusively elite solo queue. Despite being, a 52-53% win rate elite champion, we hadn't seen her in pro play for forever. We're in a metagame where people want to play magic damage, high tempo, high damage, carry style junglers. Unsurprisingly, Nidalee is up there. To me, seeing Nidalee as a 50% pro presence champion is kind of working as intended if the metagame favors playing AP junglers. Like, it should be Nidalee more than it should be Brand and Zyra. Like, let's be clear here. But in general, looking at champions where, Lilia, when she first came out, my understanding, I don't remember this, but I've been told, was incredibly elite skewed. Then there were a bunch of changes to Lilia that happened after a few months, and then she became incredibly low elo skewed. And then more recently, we've managed to roughly flatten this out to where Lilia can probably be a roughly like 50% generic win rate champion. We nerfed her a bit a couple patches ago. She was like doing really, really well when Faded Ashes and whatnot came out. We nerfed her, nerfed some healing like 2 patches ago. We're doing some more taps here to Lily because she's still one of the absolute top performers. I think she is number 1 or number 2 behind Nidalee for pro play junglers. I think, at this point, now that she doesn't have severe MMR skew, she can be just roughly 50% and is pretty reasonable. We're going to go for kind of some, adjustments there, but also looking at champions like Brand and Zyra and whatnot and seeing that, well, okay, Zyra's only really going to play by the LPL. Brand's getting played a little bit everywhere, but he's still like a top 6 jungler. Like, can we make sure that these sort of non-historic junglers are, 1, still viable for those who want to play the champion, and 2, like, don't again usurp jungle pick rate from traditional junglers. There's just an incumbency bias that players seem to really appreciate that, at least for now, we're willing to uphold. And so, I think it's reasonable to treat Nidalee and Lilia more favorably to someone like Brand or Zyra, where they've got a second role to play in, for example, and they haven't traditionally been junglers, but having them be viable, I think, is fine. Is there something I want to say here? I don't think so, really. So yeah, pretty much that's the thought here on the best performing AP junglers. We'll talk more about them specifically when we get to the changes themselves. Otherwise, in this patch, there's some corrections on misses. We had some overbuffs, some overnerfs. We're going to go hit those in this patch. And then also a few champions that just players finally caught on to how good they were. They've been this good for a while, but in general, I've defended this a few times. We will tend to not nerf things until players understand their OP. I know Mickey was playing some Poppy at MSI, and then Poppy's pick rate spiked for a little bit, and then no one cared again. So it's like, well, Poppy's still OP, but until everyone realizes it, I guess we'll just leave her. And so that's just kind of the case we're in. So, when players finally catch on, okay, you finally caught on. Okay, is it time to act? Maybe we wait a patch, maybe we don't. Okay, finally, time to bop them down to a more appropriate win rate. Okay, so let's talk about what's in this patch. First, a set of systems nerf, Absorb Life. So we're basically taking the stance here that Absorb Life, instead of being theoretically balanced, is going to be theoretically weak. So the top level tray in Precision, right, has Absorb Life, Presence of Mind, and Triumph. And Presence of Mind is only for champs who need the mana. Triumph is solo queue only because the number of kills directly impacts how strong this rune is, and so obviously it's not going to be very good in pro play. And then Absorb Life asks how good you are at CSing. Now, I do think that there is some design work we could do on Absorb Life. Like, for example, it could have a 20-second cooldown and heal for like 4 instead of 1 at level 1. And so for an average League of Legends player, it's going to be the same healing throughput because that's just how good you are at last hitting. You're going to get like 6.5 CS a minute, and that's okay. And then if you're any given pro player and you're getting 11 CS a minute, well, Absorb Life is literally twice as good for them. Just like Triumph is 3 times as good in solo queue, Absorb Life is 3 times as good in pro play, or twice as good in pro play. And I think it's worth having some level of design work done to like balance those disparities out. But unsurprisingly, the types of things we see in solo queue, which is Triumph is good and things that work well with Triumph work very well. So having high health totals and getting low and scrapping, Triumph rewards all this stuff, and playing aggressively and getting 20 gold per takedown, that rewards all this stuff. In pro play, perfect CS and withstanding harass. That's what Absorb Life, rewards. And so is this a slightly cursed design problem? Only a little. I think, again, we can do things like add a cooldown and whatnot. And if we get the time to do that work, we can do that. To like slightly unpro skew this rune. Okay, fine. That can be done at some point. The other thing is we're just generally speaking going to say, hey, at the current solo queue environment, Absorb Life is just going to be weak on average. If you really, really want sustain, you can have it. But like, you should probably just run Triumph, and this will probably still be a tuning where Absorb Life is probably relatively balanced against Triumph in pro play because, again, the number of takedowns. But yeah, basically the shot call is Absorb Life is going to be generically weak in League of Legends in solo queue, and you should tend to not pick it unless you are really good at last hitting or you really, really, really need the sustain. Not so much in lane. The early game sustain has been cut by quite a lot. The late game sustain, less so. That was always the goal, by the way. The design intent of the rune was always to have it be a late game sustain rune, a way to maybe run this rune and acknowledge that you're not going to run something like Legend Bloodline to top yourself off later on in the game, but you're going to run this, but you really want Legend Alacrity because you really want the attack speed or whatever, or you're bound to Legend Haste, but this is a way to like sustain back up later on. Maybe we're still far from that, but that was kind of the goal here. Anyway, Fleet Footwork we are also nerfing as well. Yeah, this rune is, of course, quite strong. We're seeing it do a lot for solo lanes. One thing that we did a little while ago was shift the power a little bit late game on this rune by saying, okay, well, it's not a very good lane sustain rune. That was reasonable. We pretty much went power neutral on that change, which was fine. That was the goal at the time, was to go power neutral, but shift the rune away from lane sustain. That was true for Fleet. That was true for Absorb Life, a couple patches ago as well. Like those both, hit as far as those goals were concerned. The point here is like, now it's just nerf Fleet. One thing about making it a really strong level scaler is that it is slightly disproportionately better in solo lanes who tend to be about a level and a half up on the average bot laner. So, part of the power is locked more behind being in a solo lane, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the move speed on this rune is really, really hard for regular people to use and much more reasonable for a professional player to use. Someone who's playing on 0 ping, who has really good hands, who's, really, really locked in. So we're like slightly unpro skewing Fleet Footwork because, 20% move speed for 1.25 versus 15% move speed for 1.0 seconds is a very meaningful nerf to the amount of move speed for Chovy. For me, it's not. Right. And, for most of us, it's not that big of a deal. And yeah, there's some sustain down, right? This is like up to 14% less healing. Like this matters, right? Like this does something, sure. But at the end of the day, it's intentionally a pro skewed nerf. I mean, we'll see what happens here to win rate. Like we can look at, Caitlyn's Fleet Footwork, win rate before and after the patch compared to something like PTA and see where it goes and, see the results here. But the goal here is to be a pro skewed nerf to Fleet Footwork. Cut down, we pretty much knew we were overbuffing it when we buffed this thing in 14.11. It just didn't get very much pick rate. Realistically, players are very, very slow to move runes around. Most players do not optimize runes. They just wait for their favorite third-party program or their favorite influence to tell them what runes to run, and they do that. That is the majority of players. It's really, really not close. A champ could have a accidentally horrible recommended rune page, such as Legend Haste on Yasuo or Yone, and like half of players will still have Legend Haste because they never bothered to look at the rune page. And there's like, yeah, I just picked the recommended, and like, oh, these runes are trash, oops. And just half of them will never change. And half of them might look once they realize that it's trash, but like, yeah, so, ultimately, it was overbuffed. Acknowledge that it was overbuffed. Players switched over. It's too good. We're nerfing it back down to where it was, which is the appropriate kind of power level for this rune back in 14.10. Hopefully enough players realize the cut down is good and they'll keep playing it. Hopefully, I think that'll be the case here. But yeah, this is of course, generic nerf to precision tree users. If we're going to math it out and pretend that all damage is equal, this is, you're doing what, 1/6 less of 8% more damage. So it's a 1%-ish damage nerf to every champ who plays precision and goes cut down, which is like 0.5% win rate. I guess you could math. Is that accurate? Am I griefing here on the math here? Whatever. Either way, yeah, this is what's happening. Moving on. I'm not going to bother doing the math in my head. I didn't bother. Next up is Warmog's Armor. Yeah, Warmog's Armor, right? I buffed this one really severely because it was getting unpicked, and I wanted, people to feel good about their high HP purchases. Ultimately, Warmog's as it stands now is just like incredibly, incredibly overpowered, especially the out-of-combat move speed portion, which actually skews it pretty heavily towards support. And the fact that, yeah, it's just like, it's not that hard to get the evolve on. That's fine. One thing that's tough, by the way, with support win rates is because Warmogs is so expensive. Just like seeing Warmogs versus Locket win rates is fake because the fact that it costs like 1,000 extra gold is just an incredibly large bias in terms of item win rate. But ultimately, long term, like the fact that optimizing players have just chose to buy this item every single game means it really probably is, even outside of win rate bias, is just probably too good. And so 200 gold more expensive and 5% off the out-of-combat move speed are both pretty meaningful swings. Dropping it a decent amount here. I think it's about 10% less item per item is like the rough throughput here of what happens here. And hopefully is enough to get people to switch back off of Warmogs being the best item in the game. Right, if it's not the best item of the game anymore, even if it's still the best support item, it's probably still about 1% win rate for all the support tanks, which means everyone else claws that back right away. And also we might just be able to see item choice back again in tank supports. And then a similar boat, Celestial Opposition. This has just very clearly become, it's not only the most common support item upgrade, and we'd like there to be choice, and Celestial Opposition is the generic choice. It's It's always going to be there. It doesn't have to be like the most dominant choice overall. And also looking at pro play, it is by far the most common support upgrade here for the tank supports as well. So we know this will disproportionately nerf tank supports there as well. And so in an effort to create some more variation in champ select in pro play, a nerf to the things that the tank supports are kind of ubiquitously using here. All right, we're going to move on to champion buffs. So I think there was still one flaw with Varus's kit, which is that his W for his conventional builds still does not scale off of gold. It does a little bit because bonus attack speed scales into his passive, which scales into AP, which scales into W. That exists and is real, is relevant, does in fact add damage. But as much as I'm willing to support AP versus a build, and I'm not like rushing to remove his AP ratios by any means, he probably should have some bonus AD ratios on W because we keep seeing these Varus tank builds because W has so much base value because it was tuned around and ever scaling off anything basically that it turns out if that's enough damage, you can just build tank and only rely on W. Varus also has pretty good attack damage growth, pretty good attack speed growth. He just has a lot of stuff for free that doesn't have gold scaling on it. It's why his passive has the level of gold scaling it does, and it's why in this patch we are buffing the only AD ratios in the kit, both the Q and the E. So right now, Varus, lethality builds are substantially weaker than on-hit builds, and what's nice is on-hit builds are actually running AD. They're using items like Kraken and Rageblade and Blade of the Rune King, all of which have attack damage on them. So the nice thing is he is playing up spell damage while buying the attack items. That's a good thing. That's a positive. Terminus has AD on it as well. Anyway, so a couple changes here. So first of all, converting Varus Q from a low base damage and a total AD ratio to a much higher base damage and a bonus AD ratio. The way the math works out here is if you don't buy any attack damage at all, this is roughly, it's honestly like roughly power neutral to like full tank build straight up, depending on how many levels you gain, of course. Right, because it doesn't scale off champion level past level 9 anymore. It's like better at 9, but it's like worse at 14. So depending on when you measure, it's better or worse. And of course, solo laners level up more often, so having like less level scaling of the champion, slightly nerf solo lane Varus. Intentional choice here. But we're buffing the AD ratio pretty substantially because we know Varus right now is about 1.5% underpowered from where he was before we had to start nerfing him for pro play. So the goal is to give him, on his conventional current builds, about 1.5% of win rate. We're giving that through some E bonus AD ratio, and through this overall change to Q, which is with buffs to the ratios, meant to also be power positive, and should be 1 to 1.5% win rate to Varus overall. That's the goal. If we miss, we'll of course readdress. We still have 0.18 to make further changes. That's kind of the goal here, is to move these things around here. Next up is Caitlyn. So Caitlyn we're not only nerfing her most common keystone, which is Fleet Footwork, but also she is about 1% underpowered right now, on top of the fact that we're going to nerf Fleet, and doesn't really have any pro presence, which means we have the room to give her that win rate. Now, the tough thing is, and I'm actually pretty sure part of this is just the level of power creep in League of Legends right now, which we are unwinding pretty soon in a decent way, I hope, soon, Split 3, that, hey, if we give Caitlyn any more burst, she literally one-shots you. If she becomes any safer, if she's like any more durable, she's unassailable in lane with perma-push, and Caitlyn has like a 55% first turret rate. It's like she's really good at shoving lanes forever and not getting punished for it. But also she has like the sniper fantasy, which says like, well, she should kind of have sort of low attack speed, right? And that's tough. It's like, okay, well then what can we give her? Durability is out of the question. More pushing power is really out of the question. More early game, I mean, maybe. And so like we're trying to find the things that are like reasonable here that we think can make sense to the champion, that feel good, that don't break the game in other ways. And like it always feels bad when you feel like you're kind of up against your limits on a champion, because it's like, oh wow, the game has like eclipsed this champion and they have to do something really screwed up to like function. Ooh, that's not great. So anyway, the buff here is a trap cooldown buff on Caitlyn W. Now, Caitlyn W on live scales non-linearly. It's like 30, 25, 23, like 18, 15, 12 or something weird. And this is going to be like 26 minus 4. 26, 22, 18, 14, 10, just straight up. So like technically like ranks 3 and 4 are only like a 1 second shorter cooldown, but rank 5 is 2 seconds shorter, and rank 1 is 4 seconds shorter. Anyway, she gets more traps. Congratulations. The cooldown is now slightly shorter than the trap lifetime duration at rank 1. Okay, cool. You have traps more often. You can like, control your lane a bit more. Yes, makes you a better lane bully. Okay, fine. But like, hey, 10-second recharge to get, 3 traps back. That's going to be quite nice. Instead of 36 seconds, it's going to be 30 seconds. Hey, that's pretty good. And then this is another like 2.5% buff to her attack speed ratio. I want to be really clear. People really undersell the value of more attack damage, functionally, more auto attack DPS on AD carries. So we had this last time when I did Caitlyn changes. I did this exact change of Caitlyn, where I buffed her AS ratio and I nerfed her WAD ratio and her RAD ratio. And Reddit was like losing their minds, like, if I do the math, Caitlyn only gains 2% auto attack damage, and you nerfed her W bonus AD ratio by half. And it's like, okay, but like do the actual math in terms of an entire game. Caitlyn attacks thousands of times per game. 2% more of 1,000 times per game is more auto attacks than the number of traps she lands. Guess what? This matters. And lo and behold, Caitlyn gained win rate in that patch. Because people are really bad at comparing things. When what happens like 800,000 times often, this other thing happens. Anyway, this is obviously a strict buff to the W, and it's a strict buff to her attack speed ratio. Generally speaking, if we were to give Caitlyn just straight up 5% more total attack speed, that would be like 2.5% win rate. This is half that and only to her AS scaling, which by the way does impact how much stat shards do. It impacts how much her like AS growth matters. It impacts how much bonus attack speed purchases matter. Ultimately, one thing I want to kind of point out is, though Caitlyn is a sniper and should kind of have sort of a somewhat slow, methodical attack speed pattern, the fact that she doesn't have an AS steroid at all in the kit means we probably don't have to try that hard to give her like a bad AS ratio. And like, I'm still being really shy, not going to 625 here. But I'm actually pretty sure, like, even if Caitlyn was 0.625 with like a normal attack speed growth, she would still feel like a sniper because she doesn't have rapid fire or Xayah W or Kaisa E or any of these things, and would still feel fairly methodical. Regardless, the incentive to have Caitlyn buy an attack speed item is a good thing. We would like that, and so playing this up by another 2.5 to 3%. So it's like 2.4%, I think, 2.6. Graves, these might be a little bit under. Thing is, buffing a primary clear speed skill can be a really big deal. Now, it's entirely possible we heavily undershot here on Graves, and we should give him more power. If we get it wrong, especially with Fleet Footwork nerfs, then we will give Graves more power next patch. Graves, I think, is about 1.5% underpowered. We are buffing his Q cooldown by 0 to 1 seconds, and roughing his Q1 damage by 0 to 20. You don't always get the blowback. Of course, if you're exploding Q, you're, of course, getting both halves, and you're getting the cooldown, like, permanently, basically. You're getting the base damages permanently. If you're in PvP, you sometimes only get Q1. But this should help his PvP power a fair bit and help his repeatability. In general, if Graves is more about repeatability and less about one-shotting you, I think it's a healthier space for the champion to be. So that's why I played up the parts of Q that are reliable on enemy champions and repeatability on Q. Kindred, we are reverting the Q attack speed nerf from a few patches ago. The Kraken Slayer nerf immediately hit Kindred. Kindred are probably about 1 to 1.5% underpowered. This is probably about 0.5 or less % win rate. Not a huge deal, but it's going to be something. It's an easy walkback because specifically Kindred's sustained DPS are just lower now, right? The other side is I don't think this is enough to make Emax second good. E appears to be about 10% of Kindred's total damage. So even though the base damage is going up by like 15%, and the ratio is going up by about 15%-ish, or 12% or somewhere around there, I don't think this is nearly enough to make Kindred, to make them switch over to maxing E second. Right now, E second has a player base of like 13%, and they're incredibly wrong. It's like 4% lower win rate than W. I'll sort of reiterate something I said in a prior video, which is I think it is valuable to give champions choice in skill ranks when the skill ranks are reasonable. I think it has some value and gives room for some skill expression. I think the bigger problem is when the intuitive max is wrong, or like learning the correct skill order like feels impossible because it's so unintuitive, and like the like causes and reasons are weird. Anyway, I think, maxing E second doesn't fail any of these. I think it is reasonable to think you might want to max E second on Kindred. It is also one of the places where, hey, this champion loses win rate in low elo because more players max the wrong thing. And ultimately, just giving Kindred some more burst damage I think is reasonable. They're a damage champion. Let them have fun. Okay, great. But again, goals are around 1% here. I suspect this E buff is not quite enough, but we were being cautious here. The fact that we can look at the results of this patch and then react and then make further changes in 0.18 if needed, we're basically just being safe in a lot of these cases, and then say, oh, if it's under, we like do the rest of the buff that we wanted to do. And if it's fine, then okay, great, right? But we do have a patch to react in time for Worlds. Lissandra Q. We have buffed Lissandra Q a fair bit. This ends up being, despite being almost half of Lissandra's damage, this ends up being pretty low win rate, which is kind of interesting to me. Lissandra doesn't seem to be that sensitive to damage increases. It seems that a lot of Lissandra's power is just simply in CC, and so relative to a champion like maybe, Xerath, where if you give Xerath, 10% more damage on half of his damage, you would expect like a pretty big win rate increase, and that's just like we haven't seen that with Lissandra so far through AP ratio buffs, base damage buffs, any of those. Doing all the math like out through her entire build. So this is probably going to be under 1% win rate of Q damage, but making rank 5 a little bit nicer, and then also playing up the R slow. It used to scale non-linearly. It spiked at rank 3, and now it's going to scale nice linearly, plus 15, plus 15, plus 0. Basically giving Lissandra some early game power, essentially, but largely in, like, I can go wave clear and join my team and go roam and, like, go make plays, and just overall it's team fight time and go lay down some CC. Generally speaking, I'm a really big fan of juicing utility when it can make sense, especially when it fits the champion. So, like, I think Kindred is a reasonable champion to say, like, Kindred is not there to be utility. They already have R. That's enough. You're a damage champion. Too bad. Like, go snowball and do well. Go use your AD ratio. Go use your marks to do the missing health damage. In Lissandra's case, I think, saying, hey, Lissandra, you're kind of a selfless champion. You dive in and, like, separate the enemy team and do cool stuff. Like, cool, have some wave clear, go roam, right? We don't need more gold scaling. You could be selfless here and go slow people down and be a good team fight innovator, right? Like, I think that's a good place to move Lissandra, and so that's kind of the changes here. Rise, pretty simple, plus 5 flat damage on Q at all ranks. Gives some more wave clear, gives him some trading power. Also, juicing the ulti cooldown pretty well by 30, 20, 10 seconds at rank 3. There's two things here. One, more casts on R is cool, right? This is one of the cool buttons on Rise's kit. And also in general, I'm actually happy with doing this with Azir way back when as well, is when you have a very, very long cooldown spell, it can be harder to learn using the ability correctly. And so by buffing up the cooldown, you get more chance to use it and learn the champion and excel on him and whatnot. And so a bit of power to Rise, maybe about 1% win rate. Okay, cool. And then finally, a simple buff Twisted Fate. We are buffing the first max for APTF. ADTF is at a fairly appropriate power level. He's a niche pick, and that's fine. In general, the marching orders in general, I said in general twice, for alternate builds is that they can be on the outskirts of viable. They can be situationally useful. If you want to optimize in one trick, you can get there. But on average, they shouldn't crowd out other picks. And this is things like Jungle Brand. This is things like ADTF. But AP Twisted Fate should definitely be in a pretty good spot. Investigating his AP build specifically, like, Twisted Fate's overall win rate doesn't look amazing, but also like 8% of his plays are playing ADTF, which is appropriately about 48% win rate. Even for APTF, there's a little bit of room we can give him. And so, yep, we're boosting some early wave clear. Twisted Fate is another champion that is not traditionally a hyper carry. He's there to be a bit selfless, juicing up some of his base values, especially one that he does not max anytime soon as ADTF, means it's going to be an APTF skewed buff. I don't see ADTF maxing this one. And we get kind of what we want here. Okay, we are nerfing some AP junglers. Right now, only 2. Of course, we did nerf Nidalee a little while ago. We are going to reserve the right to nerf Nidalee, nerf Zyra as needed. Lilia, we are nerfing the jungle monster cap damage here by 0 to 50 based on champion level. Of course, she still has Faded Ashes, she still has Q and W and all these other tools. Those all matter. But the goal here basically is, generally speaking, we expect AP junglers to have pretty good clears. They're going to be some of the faster clears in the game from first epic onward. Generally speaking, this ends up being true because their gank setup is pretty bad. Often their dueling is pretty poor. In order to be a balanced champion, they tend to be faster clearers on average. That's fine. Tanks tend to have slower clears on average because they have very, very good gank setup, and they can sacrifice camps and still be full power, which means they can get their teammates farther and farther ahead. This makes sense. On the other side, AP junglers are kind of the opposite of that, right? They have to have a lot of gold. They have to be carries. They don't have a lot of baseline utility frequently. And so they have to be relatively fast clearers. Now, that said, there is a rate at which you can clear the jungle that feels fair. And so the goals here are specifically going after some clear speed in the late game. Generally speaking, clear one and so for Lilia and Brand, we are comfortable with the current pacing. We could have brought them down. We chose not to. We chose to keep clear 1 the way it is and go after later game clears a little bit here to try to make their mid game feel appropriate. and we'll measure the win rate impact here. We'll measure the overall clear times afterwards. We'll measure what's going on. And if we have to act again, we will. But the point here is to specifically try to bring down the most egregious high-speed clearers and make them feel a little bit more like other champions while still keeping them as viable and optional champions. Of course, Lilia only exists in the jungle. There is no reason to put Lilia at 49. She should be 50-ish. So again, if we overnerf, we will give something back, with no problem here. For Brand, it is a change of a couple of rules and I believe some simplifications. So my understanding is there is now a separate dot cap for epic monsters, which is still 70, and large monsters was now 30. This is by the way, the damage over time per second. So it is divided by 4, which is 7.5, or in this case, 17.5, that you would never reach in any realistic scenario fighting any blue or red buff. Your first clear will not be affected. There's too much required health for this cap to be reached, but eventually you'll run into this a little bit on your 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, etc. clears as camps get more health, especially red and blue, whose health scales more quickly than things like Krug and Gromp. There's also a rules change. I believe nowhere in the tooltip was it ever stated that the explosion dealt half damage to epic monsters. That rule has been changed to your explosion has a damage cap of this. I believe this is 1, 6, 11, 16. I don't know 100%, but I'm pretty sure this is. And this says, okay, well, when you're fighting epic monster and you're fighting dragon at level 6, you can explode for 325. And by the way, you can still dot for 70 DPS per blaze stack for, 4 seconds, whatever, right? Like, the champ's still good at killing dragon, right? But hey, what's going to happen here is he's going to less aggressively turbo Astro one-shot, one combo every camp in the game. The goal here is to make him have to, wait a little bit longer, keep the dot on, maybe cast a 4th spell or something to slow down the functionally like comical nature of Brand's like, I've got all my cooldowns now, let's go one-shot the jungle clears that once he's got kind of Faded Ashes, he kind of goes to the moon. And so a cap that'll matter a little bit for these single target camps, because obviously the AoEs get one-shot by WE anyway, or EW. And then this cap that says, hey, you might have to take a little bit longer to finish Big Krug or finish Gromp or finish Red or Blue or whatever. And again, we're skipping Zyra and Italy for now. If we fit them, we will. Zyra's Suliki win rates do not look very good. So we are holding for now. Also, only LPL is really playing Zyra right now, so we're not sure it's that big of a deal, that urgent. We'll wait to see. LCK playoffs, my understanding, are on 0.16, so we'll see how they feel about the patch that's currently live today and what they're playing there, and we'll use that to help inform. But otherwise, LEC and LPL and LCS aren't moving forward patches anymore, so the patch we're talking about right now is not going to see pro play. We're going to see it in 0.18. And again, Italy, we're waiting for now as well. Traditionally, a champion we've balanced around elite solo queue. I think she's in pro play is pretty cool. We'll see if we move here. We'll see if we don't. We'll wait and see. Let's talk about the rest of the nerfs here. There's going to be 2 more slides talking about nerfs. Up first, we are nerfing Aurora's ultimate by 25, 50, 75 base damage. AP ratio unchanged. Rest of the kit unchanged. I don't have numbers at my fingertips right now for the amount of damage that comes out of Aurora R. I used Lysandra as a comparison point. And for Lysandra, about 20% of her damage is R, and so if I assume that's true for Aurora as well, this nerf ends up being about 10% less R damage, which would be about 1% win rate. Now, Aurora might not be, 10% of her damage is R, or 20% of her damage might not be R, in which case it's going to be an under nerf. It requires meaningful effort to pull that data. It is not a readily made report, and so I just don't have it right now. But like, it was really, really crucial. We could obviously get that. I just don't have it at my fingertips. Regardless, the goal here is that Lysandra Aurora at current timing is probably overpowered by about 1%. We were seeing a lot of pro play from this champion. She had a 67% presence and then was administratively disabled because she, for some reason, broke Chrono Break. I don't know how, but we're investigating that. So Aurora immediately kind of jumped in pro play. Appears to be very, very strong from solo queue. Her ban rate's not falling very quickly. It's going down 3% per week from 53% to 50%. That is very, very large. Win rates are 51% in moderately high elos on modern day after all the micro patches. This seems to be a little bit too strong for a champ who people have almost certainly not finished mastering yet. She's not that easy. So minus 1% on Aurora. I believe we'll probably have to do another 1% at some other point in time down the line. I am fingers crossed Aurora is not 100% presence at Worlds. I really don't want her to be. I think that's going to be a bad look. So I'll do what I can to figure out if people think that she would be. But yeah, I do not want Aurora to be, red 1 permaban the entire tournament. That would really suck. That's not the goal here. Next up is Ashe and Ezreal. I will talk about them together. These two have been the top 2 AD carries in bot lane and pro play. for a very long time. We'll talk about Ezreal first. We gave Ezreal specifically a pro skewed buff, I think last MSI, which was 2 base AD, because we know pros will use early laning power a lot. And we're finally here, where Ezreal is, of course, quite heavily in pro play. Not a big surprise. Finally going back on that change here. It'll have some sort of impact, of course. It'll have some win rate impact, but hopefully he's not just the default pick in pro play. As the default lane bully is not really what his goal is meant to be. I think Ezreal, like, vaguely falls off is probably appropriate how safe he is, but he's just sort of too good of a lane bully. And so trying to bring that down a little bit, and, you know, like, the power curve could be a little bit softer than it is right now. Ashe, just sort of minus 30 health. She's also a very, very good laner. She has actually really, really good early laning stats because if she starts getting ahead, she just runs you down with Frost Shot. And so because Ashe kind of auto-wins any long-term engagement because she has just deal 15% more damage, the passive, has You Can't Run Away From Me, the passive, and actually a very, very good attack steroid in her Q, because it gives her like 20% more damage and like 20% attack speed. It's very, very good. It's sometimes quite nice. I buffed it and it made the spell feel great. Like, you know, Ashe kind of had a revival in terms of AD carry pick rate. I think some of that was the Q feeling better. And it's like, okay, that's cool, but Ashe is just like a little too dominant in pro play right now. Now, some of this as well, to be clear, is probably the fact that, well, they're already playing things like Zeri or Tristana for a primary carry in mid lane, so you can play a more supportive champion at bot lane. That's part of it for sure. But end of the day, just for like what's correct for Ashe the champion, she has 600 range. She can run you down forever. She kind of auto wins sustained engagements through all these levers on her kit. She should be relatively weak to all-ins. Yeah, she has no dash. Deal with it. You have volley. You can last it from safety. You have 600 base range. Like, you can deal with it. I'm a very big fan of shuffling around base stats. Just like every time I see them, to be like, but does this make sense for your champion relative to other champions in your role and in your class? And I'm very happy to move them anytime they don't like feel like they fit the mold. And so Ashe to me is one of the meant to be. I know she has no escape, right? But should probably still be one of the squishier AD carries. Katarina, we just simply overbuffed. We made some cool changes, right? She needed some power. AP Cat was feeling pretty bad. And ultimately, Katarina players were actually still kind of screwing up by not building appropriately. Lichbane first slot is far, far superior to Nashor's Tooth first slot, which is also doing better than Blade of the Ruin King first slot. Now, in general, generally speaking, AP Cat should do better than AD Cat. And on hit should be a little bit weaker, AP or AD in this case. On hit should be a little bit weaker than, you know, Assassiny like Burst Katarina. Like, to be clear, the disparity is a little bit larger than it needs to be, and optimally built AP Burst Katarina is just actually overpowered right now. And so the buffs were nice. We gave her enough AP rates to feel good about building AP. Okay, that's wonderful. We threw a lot in there, ultimately overshot a little bit. And so we're looking at minus 1% win rate, which is a flat 10% off the ability power of her passive. Again, goals are -1. If we overshoot, if we undershoot, we will adjust, but the goal is minus 10% here. Minus 1% win rate. Kennen, we gave him a lot of power. We let his ulti move while casting. We said, okay, we're going to give him this, and then we will react based on how much power it is, and we will nerf him when it's appropriate, when his pick rate, when his ban rate spike. We nerfed him back in, I forget when, 0.12 or something. I don't remember exactly. We gave him like less base health and something else, and it didn't have a very big impact. It had a sub 1% winner impact when the R buff was like 1.5. And so I was like, okay, we've got to go harder. We've got to take the other 1% here because he's finally showing up in pro. Okay, that's cool, but like he's just statistically clearly overpowered. We need to take him down. And so 10% AP ratio off Q, I think is very reasonable here. Kennen, weaker champion, minus 1% win rate. That's kind of the goal here. Hope we hit it. And then LeBlanc, yeah, LeBlanc is finally saved. She is clearly back. This is a champion who had often been pro-jailed at like a 46 or 47% win rate. She's above 50 in a lot of ELO markers right now. Like, this is the strongest LeBlanc has been in like what feels like 7 years for solo queue win rate. And it's AP LeBlanc, and she's so back, and she's also got like a 40% ban rate or something. We did elect to wait. We intentionally waited in a 0.16 to see if we could have more LeBlanc in like pro play, in playoffs and whatnot. Like, hey, at least here's one of the AP champs the pros will actually play. And so we left it for a patch because it was a playoff patch for like LCS and LCK postseason. That was intentional. We left her overpowered for a patch because of that. We're now bringing her down by 1%. We're not willing to be like, well, LeBlanc will lead the charge. She'll be the one good AP mid laner. We are still committed to doing all the other systems changes that was needed to bring down AD mids, to bring down AP junglers, to let AP mids not be troll. And so the point here is, yep, here you go. Minus 5% AP. This champ is doing too well. We tapped down the abilities that require no real skill to land. You got to go land the skill shot, go figure it out, go land your E, go land more to your combo, get your second mark of R or something, but, figure it out. Q and W just not going to do it all for you. You're not just going to one-shot people. Second round of nerfs, Pike, purely for solo queue. The last round of nerfs to his W did not hit the mark. We did not nerf him by enough. Pike has just been a strong performer for a very, very long time. Pike is probably supposed to be 50-ish% win rate in moderately high elo. He's above that, so we're looking for about 1% win rate. Because I think Pike's base armor is like 47 or something. 4 armor has less impact than if his base armor were like 12. So we think it's going to be about 1% win rate, even though 3 armor tends to be 1% win rate. I think for him, 4 is going to be about right. For Rumble, we are taking 1% max health target damage off of each punch of the passive. I am not certain if this runs into the jungle cap or not. I remember when I built this out, when I did the Rumble changes last year, I forget, honestly. I think I roughly set the cap so that, like, around 1,500 health at level 1 would be roughly the cap, which means anything with more than 1,500 health was capping anyway, which means lowering the max HP shouldn't very meaningfully affect him because he's going to run into cap regardless. If I recall correctly, that's actually how the math works out here. So Rumble should probably still be fine in the jungle, but we are trying to bring down Rumble's ability to basically beat all-ins, because Rumble already outranges his opponents in top lane. And if he also wins the all-in when you finally dive him, there's no counterplay to Rumble, and so the designer chose the anti-all-in power as the thing to strip away from Rumble here, to step down a little bit so that you can maybe try to all-in him a bit more often, and it might work for you. Senna was just very clearly overbuffed last patch. It was hard to know exactly how much she was going to lose from the attack speed ratio nerf and the crit nerf, and how much she was going to get from base damage and everything else here. Ultimately, of course, Senna was overbuffed. So some of this is the AP Enchanter build is clearly too good. That has to go down some. Some of this is that even her pivot builds into Black Cleaver are also doing too well. So there is a base value nerf here. Also, several of the Black Cleaver users are doing Black Cleaver into Moonstone or Black Cleaver into Echoes of Helia. So even a lot of the Cleaver builds are going to see this AP ratio nerf matter a bit here as well. But overall, the goal is minus 3% to generic Enchanter Echoes Moonstone builds, and minus about 1.25 to Black Cleaver X as the follow-on build here. That's kind of the point. That's the goal. If we miss the mark, if Cleaver Senna is still like 53, we have to go a little bit harder and bring her down a bit more. Ultimately, I think the shape of Senna is a lot more supportive in her outputs, has more crowd control, has more throughput for helping her team, is less the solo carry. This is the best way, in my opinion, to get Senna out of what has ended up being pro jail, because the more that she is the solo carry, you just play Ornn bot lane with Senna. She's your primary carry, and it just works because that's how pro play is going to work. In solo queue, players don't do that. If they were, she would still be a 53% win rate champion even last patch. But because they don't, trying to play up well, you're probably playing her alongside an ADC in most cases. So let's make sure she's doing remotely useful things when she's laning with Ezreal or laning with Lucian or whatever else here. And so do want to keep the supportive aspects. Do not want Enchanter to eclipse her AD builds, at least not that strongly. Cleaver should just kind of be the default best purchase. That's fine. And moving on to that direction. Next is Seraphine. Seraphine, for I think the first time literally ever in her entire history, is finally an overpowered support. It's been her most popular build since day 2 of Seraphine existing as a champion and has never left. And for the first time in history, she's actually OP. Now, she's very OP via WMAX. This is a incredibly strong skill order. Most Seraphine players don't do it, so most Seraphines are not going to see a very big win rate drop. And in fact, for the bot lane Seraphines, go have fun. Max QE, you can feel unchanged. Congrats. Until level 14, your champ is unnerfed. Have fun out there, bot lane Seraphine players. But for the ones who are maxing W first, and those who are maxing at second, it is going down a meaningful amount, 0 to 20 off the shield, and 0 to 4 nerfed off of the cooldown as well. This is meant to be 1.5% win rate, maybe 1.75% win rate to W max builds. And of course, much less to any other build here. Right now, it is very clearly correct to max W. It's not close. Trying to bring that down to be more reasonable and more in line. Final nerf here is Sylas. We, of course, over-nerfed him back in 0.15. We then over-buffed him in 0.16. Sorry for the seesaw. That's my bad for getting 0.15 wrong. It's our bad for getting 0.16 wrong. But, okay, only one lever, about 1% win rate, 10% damage AP ratio off of W. I'm generally a fan of AP ratio nerfs and keeping base damages good on champions like this. It means that things like haste and health and other repeatability stats tend to then be more valuable. This is actually why, for example, in solo queue, we see a lot of Rumble players are hard rushing Shadow Flame. Now, Shadow Flame has a specific interaction with dots, which makes it especially good. It deals more bonus damage for Rumble Q and Rumble R, so it's understandable there, but he has very good ratios, and so he's building just as much flat AP as possible. Lissandra's also in this case. Lissandra has some of the most aggressive AP ratios in the game. She's one of the most aggressively AP scaling mages in League of Legends right now, and her build is also, like, 120 AP Shadow Flame, 120 AP Zhonya's, Death Cap. Like, it's all the flat AP stuff. She's not getting haste anywhere because AP is the best scaler more than haste. And the more we can say, well, Sylas, your ratios are solid, but they're not absurdly aggressive, the more that he can feel good about using haste as a modifier, using durability as a modifier because he gets more bases that way, and cares less about having to go Shadow Flame, having to go Death Cap, having to one-shot you. So directionally, big fan of this one. Small nerf for Sylas. So overall, this patch has a bunch of system changes that should affect AD carry mids and range tops overall. Fleet footwork, especially on the move speed front, should be pretty meaningful for things like if you are running fleet cannon and whatnot, just the ability to space out a top laner and bully them out and never be caught. This should affect Vayne top, things like that as well. Should be a moderate impact as well as, again, those on mid. These system changes should also affect tank supports here. Celestial, primarily picked up by tank supports. There's actually not many range supports who tend to pick this one up. Bard, I think, and Renata are the two primary ones, but otherwise it's mostly a tank support nerf here. And as well as Warmogs. Warmogs is really exclusively getting picked up by tank supports here. And so lowering the supportive outputs, the move speed, the roaming. Realistically, the fact that Warmogs just completely supplanted Trailblazer means that, I mean, honestly, I think Trailblazer kind of sucks. And of course, Warmogs is OP, so there's probably some longer term retuning that could be done, but that's where we are right now. So dropping down Warmogs and Celestial. We're re-adding some lost AD junglers. Kennen, of course, over-nerfed via item changes. Graves just has slowly fallen out over time, trying to bring Graves back. Otherwise, we buffed Wukong last patch. We buffed Vi a little bit last patch. I think we can add a couple more champions like Jarvan. We could probably put into 0.18. But some of these like easy-to-play champions supposed to live at like 51, we can try to find and kind of bring up and make them feel pretty good about themselves. And again, we're going to investigate more stuff when we start the 14.18 sprint tomorrow and see what else we think is palatable for solo queue and will have a meaningful impact in pro play to have some excitement and some room for innovators for pro teams heading into Worlds and say, oh, you know what, we're going to try to build a strat around this champ that we think is good now that no one's played yet, and we see that kind of come out, and that usually is pretty exciting. And then of course Split 3 is going to be soon after Worlds, and hopefully there's going to be some cool stuff there. I'm excited about what's going on in that one. Yeah, overall, thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye bye.